Hello, my name is Cate Crowley. I'm a professor of practice at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City. Welcome to this first module in Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Evaluations, what every EI evaluator in New York City needs to know. This module and the series of modules as part of this whole training, a series of trainings that I did for the New York City Department of Health in March and April of 2016. We trained over 600 people, both EIODs, agency evaluation coordinators, and evaluators, but I did hear from a number who were not able to make those trainings that they wondered where they could get the information, and from people who were at the trainings that wanted to share it with their colleagues who wanted to go over things. So we've decided to create these modules so people can review the training and see what is it that New York City Department of Health, Bureau of Early Intervention, requires for culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations. These modules address evaluations that primarily rely on the results of standardized and criterion reference tests to identify a child's functional level. You will see in Module 2 the problems with these tests and why that reliance is very misplaced. They'll address evaluations that describe a child's functioning level primarily by listing the child's performance on test items that you're going to see are so flawed, that fail to include and or consider the child's background and prior experiences, and that fail to show how the evaluator analyzed the data collected using informed clinical opinion. They're also intended to clarify what makes an appropriate evaluation, to increase understanding in the clinical practice on what culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations involve, and to emphasize that the skills of quality evaluators are needed in and sought by the New York City Department of Health Early Intervention. What are culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations? Well, first of all, I'd like to say every child deserves a culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluation. It's not like this particular group gets them. Every child has a culture, every child has a linguistic background, and every child deserves a culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluation. These evaluations will bring that child to life. They'll analyze the acquisition of behaviors and skills that reflect the child's prior experiences. They'll consider reliability, validity, and bias issues in the evaluation materials. They'll demonstrate understanding of the threshold level for eligibility, and they will synthesize appropriate data using quality-informed clinical opinion to determine the child's functional levels. Again, when we talk about culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations, we're not just talking about certain groups of children. Rather, every child who gets evaluated deserves an evaluation that's culturally and linguistically appropriate. Every single child. A family is like a forest. When you are outside it, it is dense. When you are inside, you see that each tree has its place. This is an African proverb that I think is so applicable here. When you're outside of the forest, you have no idea what it's like, what the trees are like. You go inside, and each tree, each child, each adult, each part of the extended family and community has its place. So the question we ask for every evaluation is, who is this child? What experiences he had in his life? And how can I be sure that my informed clinical opinion is valid with this child, with his background, his particular prior experiences? That's our question in a culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluation. So why does this training matter? Well, over the past year and a half, I've spent a lot of time reading evaluations from the field in early intervention. And this training matters because we want to increase the quality of EI evaluations so that children who are eligible receive the appropriate services. The question we ask is, what would we want for our own children? What if our children had some kind of an issue and we wanted to know, did they have a problem? Were they eligible for EI services? What was the problem? We would want those questions answered by the evaluator. And culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations are going to lead us in that direction. So how do we evaluate Maya's development? This is a little girl. The video's on YouTube. And well, you'll see her story now. So here's Maya on her second birthday. She has sounds and sass, but no words. She uses sound approximations, gestures. Here she is, you can hear her.
Some fruit.
2 years, 2 weeks old.
Yeah? What should we do with the fruit?
You can see a very engaged child who wants to communicate, probably was taught the sign more at some point. She definitely had been getting EI since she was 10 months old. Over a year later, nobody mentioned AAC to the family. So at 2 years, 4 months old, the family started to try to teach her how to use picture cards. So they were helpful, but not true communication. So 2 months after that, Maya undergoes preschool evaluations. She's found to be in the 0.4th percentile for cognitive functioning, and she's determined to have a receptive vocabulary of 2 to 3 words. Luckily, the family does not believe the reports. So they start a communication app with Maya, and this video is 1 month after that preschool evaluation.
All right, what are we going to say? We're going to have some breakfast.
Food.
Where is
Breakfast.
the waffle? Can you show me the waffle?
Waffle.
Waffle? Are we going to have waffles? Yeah? Let's see.
Waffle. Milk.
No, we're not going to have milk. We're going to say, I want waffle.
Please.
I want waffle, please. What are you trying to say?
Milk.
So as you can see with Maya, her evaluation of her cognitive skills were entrenched with her motor skills. She was certainly misidentified as a child with an extremely low cognitive level. And certainly her receptive language was much higher. She knew she wanted milk, and she figured out how to ask for it. So let's be clear. What EI wants is what is in this training. Sometimes people over the years have piled up all conceptions about what EI requires. Maybe one EI person 10 years ago said, we want this, and that might be the bear at the bottom or then the bull, and all these misconceptions about what EI wants in terms of evaluation. So part of this training and part of why New York City Department of Health asked me to do this training was to let people know really what is needed. Another group of people have a whole different, another person may have an entirely different idea about what is required for EI evaluations. This one, somebody might have said, no, we need a standard score for every kid, or you must use the Rossetti or the whatever. But it's a bunch of misconceptions. What EI wants is what is in this training. So let's read an email that I received from a wonderful former student about a year into, not quite a year after she graduated. My agency insists that therapists use the Real-3 for bilingual Yiddish English-speaking children. My supervisor, an evaluator with over 30 years of experience, understands the weaknesses of standardized assessment tools and encourages me to rely on my knowledge of what is considered typical development in the community we are servicing. That's where this should stop. The person with experience says, let's gather our informed clinical opinion. I will work with you and we'll figure out whether this child has a disability or not, is eligible for services. But sadly, the email goes on. However, she complies with the regulations of the agency and continues to provide test scores. The regulations of the agencies don't have regulations. Regulations are New York City Department of Ed, New York City Department of Health, the state education departments, the state departments of health. Agencies do not have regulations. They are not a regulatory body. As a CF, I've been doing the same. Today I administered the Real and qualified for services a kid I was going to discharge. Well, getting an email like this from the field is one thing that really sinks my hope. So the question is, how would an evaluator give the Real in any language based on this statement? Was the Real standardized or considered? Did it consider the authors, the publishers, Yiddish English speakers in New York City? Well, I said, yes, but the Real says it can be used. Here's the eligibility criteria. The Real is appropriate for use with infants and toddlers from birth through 36 months. If the primary language of the home and child is not English, care should be taken in choosing the Real. If the real is used, the language of the home and the child, if applicable, should be noted, and the result should be interpreted to account for this fact. The stage and patterns of development of emergent language skills, however, are similar in any language. Therefore, if the examiner is familiar with both the home language and English, or if an interpreter is available, the real three may be used. Okay, there are so many falsehoods in that statement and lack of understanding about good tests that I would really question the entire reel based on that one paragraph. Do patterns of development and emergent language skills, are they similar in any language? And then when we look at the reel, are they really looking at development the way we look at when a child uses the first words, when they put two words together? Or does the reel look at whether the child can read a book, whether they can tell a story, whether they can use, say, bye-bye and hi? Is it whether they can identify body parts? That's not emergent language skills. That's not normal development. And then if the evaluator is familiar with the home language and English, then you can use the reel. And if an interpreter is available, an interpreter, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, the American Psychological Association, anything that has information about assessment has a statement that you cannot provide scores if an interpreter is used, if the test is simply interpreted or translated. Can't do it. The New York State Education Department has a statement about that for their New York State licensed SLPs, of which everyone doing speech evaluations in EI must be. So any internal agency evaluation requirements or regulations must be consistent with culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations. So that whole pile, starting with the two bears by each of these evaluators or agencies, has to be gotten rid of. They're just not accurate. So what I ask is that you sort of clean the board and get rid of these preconceived notions about what EI wants, because what EI wants is in this training. The majority of us, so we did a survey monkey of everybody who was coming to the trainings. And we learned some really interesting things. We learned that the majority of us have been working in EI for more than 11 years. Well, things have changed. The laws and regulations have changed. The people in EI have changed. Appropriate clinical practice has changed. Even the children we see are different. They are certainly more racially and ethnically diverse. They are more culturally and linguistically diverse, and they're more bilingual. So now you may be asking, wait a second, Cate Crowley. I already know that what you're going to tell me is not accurate. So let's see. What happened during the trainings, which was fun, is that a lot of people said, wait, what you're saying is you don't have to provide standardized test scores for EI evaluations? Well, you must. That's the feedback we got from the evaluators and the agencies. So New York City Department of Health EI wrote these questions and the answers. So we'll just go through them. Question 1. Will the New York City Department of Health Bureau of Early Intervention accept multidisciplinary evaluations in which there is no standardized test used to establish a developmental disability? And the answer is yes. Yes. However, the New York State Department of Health EI evaluations and guidance state that an evaluator should use a standardized instrument when it is appropriate to the child's culture, language, and developmental concerns, and the instrument has appropriate levels of sensitivity and specificity. It is incumbent on the multidisciplinary evaluation team to determine whether specific instruments meet the above requirements in relation to the unique characteristics of this child. Now, anybody who has been using a standardized test to identify, or a criterion reference test, and using those numbers to identify a developmental disability must have analyzed that test for content, construct validity, sensitivity, and specificity, and of course bias. If you were to do that, you would see that the vast number of tests used in EI fail this standard that's embedded in the New York State Department of Health EI regulations. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in Module 2. So here's more. Will the Bureau of Early Intervention accept multidisciplinary evaluations in which there was no standardized test used to establish a developmental delay? Yes. Again, New York City Department of Health says, regardless of whether a standardized instrument is used or not, all evaluators must provide detailed clinical observations, informed clinical opinion and parent observations and perceptions about their child's development, and any other pertinent information such as medical history, family history, etc., to support the child's reported level of functioning and developmental domain status. What you want to do is reference the developmental milestones and clinical clues or risk factors from the New York State Department of Health Clinical Practice Guidelines. When standardized tests are used, scores should not be used in isolation, and you have to make sure whether the test or instrument is appropriate to assess given the specific knowledge that you get during the eval of the individual child's prior experiences, its relevance to the individual's family, culture, and background, and the functional relevance and the individual child's ability to acquire skills. So let me repeat that to be clear. Will New York City Department of Health Bureau of Early Intervention accept multidisciplinary evals in which there was no standardized test used to establish a developmental delay? And the answer is yes. Question 2, are evaluators required to use a standardized test for an English-speaking child? And the answer is no. If an evaluator determines that a standardized test is not appropriate to the child's culture, language, and developmental concerns, or the instrument does not represent the child's developmental level, the evaluator should provide written justification in the evaluation report why such instrument or instruments are not appropriate or available for this child. Again, we're going to look a little more at this in Module 2. I want you to know I've done many EI evaluations for the New York City Department of Health. I have not included a standardized test or a criterion reference score or age equivalency for over 20 years, and I do not have my evaluations rejected. So you can read this more, but say you have a child who's from the West Indies. They're not using standard American English. They're from a very different kind of culture. If you find that the tests that are available are going to misidentify this kid, then you do not need to use them. You don't need to use them. If you find that a standardized test is going to under-identify a child, because that child comes from a very high SES and has had all the support and help and tutoring and training, even by the time we see him in EI, you do not have to use a standardized test for an English-speaking child. You have to document your procedures and methods, and you have to paint a picture of the child. So it's a new day. All that stuff you can throw aside. What EI wants is in this training. Some of us may need simply to go back to how we were trained to do evaluations in graduate school. We're like, thank goodness. I learned something in graduate school. I get out, I start working in an EI evaluation agency, and all of a sudden I'm pulled apart ethically because I don't feel I'm doing appropriate evaluations. So this will be able to bring you back to how you were trained appropriately in graduate school, for those who had that training. A smaller group of EI evaluators may need to completely retool. It's just twisted at the bottom, and they can't see anything beyond a standardized test. They don't have clinical judgment. They don't have informed clinical opinion. They haven't looked at typically developing kids to see what typical is. There's a whole bunch of redoing that has to happen for a smaller group. And others may have been doing appropriate evaluations for agencies that allowed that, and you'll be able to continue to do it. And, I do say this is not New York City Department of Health talking. This is certainly me talking. There are lots of agencies out there, and you want to make sure you're working with an agency that allows you to do quality and ethical evaluations. We all want to be able to sleep well at night. This training is based on the following. I am an attorney as well as a speech-language pathologist, and I know this stuff. You have to look at this federal law, the state law and regs, the various memos, the practice guidelines, even the provider agreement, New York City Department of Health, New York State Department of Health, and certainly the U.S. Department of Education, Part C of IDEA is about EI. So this is all based right in the regs and the law and the guidance. Current law, regulations, and policies for early intervention evaluations reflect current best practices. Too many New York City Department of Health EI evaluations do not reflect best practices. And I've looked at many EI evaluations over the past year and a half almost. And probably many of you who are listening to this know as well that many of the evaluations are not where they should be. So change needs to happen in the trenches. We have the law, we have the regs, we have the guidance. We have people who work in EI who want to bring a consultant in like me to try to do these changes. But really, the change has to happen in the trenches. Who makes this change is you evaluators. Let's look now at how New York State defines a developmental delay. So we know that there are certain diagnoses that are going to get EI services almost without consideration. I mean, there's some need to show if it's a very mild apraxia or something like that. But most of those people will get services. Autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, a certain birth weight, that kind of thing, other syndromes. In New York State, consistent with federal regulations, a child must be experiencing a delay in an area, a domain of development that is significant enough to require early intervention. So that's New York State Department of Health memorandum of 2005. So the big question is, what is significant enough? To be eligible for the EI program based on developmental delays, we all know this standard. A child has to get a 12-month delay in one or more functional areas, or a 33% delay in one area, or a 25% delay in two areas, or a score of at least 2 standard deviations below the mean in one functional area, or a score of at least 1.5 standard deviations below the mean in each of 2 domains. Okay, so I can't do a quality evaluation, one that I can feel comfortable about, if I look at the 12-month delay or the standard deviations, because I can't find a test that works for the kids that I evaluate. So I go into the middle one. 33% delay is severe. Less than 1% of the population is functioning at that level. 25% delay is mild to moderate. So I work on my informed clinical opinion by looking at typically developing kids to work within that the second bullet point, 33% delay in one functional area, 25% delay in each of 2 areas. That's how I do my evals, right there. So what is this informed clinical opinion? It's not just an opinion. It's informed and it's clinical. So it means the best use of quantitative and qualitative information by qualified personnel regarding a child and family if applicable. That's right in the regs. That's what informed clinical opinion is. When using informed clinical opinion, practitioners draw upon clinical training and experience, standardized instruments as available and appropriate, recognized clinical assessment procedures, experience with children of different cultures and languages, and their ability to gather and include family perceptions about child development. Again, that's in the memorandum. Informed clinical opinion does not correlate to the number of EI evaluations an evaluator has completed. So if you say, oh, my supervisor has 15, 20, 30 years doing EI evaluations, that does not mean that the person has informed clinical opinion. So how do we develop informed clinical opinion, right? Quality informed clinical opinion. 1, being on top of the research and understanding the statistical base for any assessment tool we use. By identifying biases in assessment materials and in many current developmental milestones. Wait till you see Module 2. By spending time assessing typically developing kids from the same age and cultural and linguistic background as the ones we are evaluating. So whenever I see a kid or whenever I'm evaluating a child, if there's a sibling who's typically developing, I'll do some stuff with that sibling to work on my informed clinical opinion. And by ensuring that we as evaluators have a deep understanding of what are appropriate developmental milestones. So how do we strengthen EI evaluations? 1, we include data on each child's family, cultural, and linguistic background. We illustrate a child's functional level by gathering a wide range of data appropriate for the child's age and experiences. So we don't just see one thing and say, we know what that's going on. We have to see a bunch of different things. And then maybe we'll only describe one or two of them in the eval, but we want to confirm that what we saw is consistent with truly the child's functional level. We want to bring this child to life in our written reports by vignettes, which is in the regs, or I call them holograms. Other people call them you paint the picture of the child. Make that child come to life. We want to determine functional levels by using our informed clinical opinion, considering that child's background and prior experiences. And we want to be able to distinguish a significant delay, right, sufficient to qualify for EI services. So that's how we're going to strengthen our EI evaluations. What is significant enough? So in 2010, there were new regs from the New York State Department of Health. And one part of them focused particularly on those children who have a delay only in the communication domain. So for children who have been found to have a delay only in the communication domain, a delay in the area of communication shall be severe delay or marked regression in communication development as determined by specific qualitative evidence-based criteria articulated in the clinical practice guidelines issued by the New York State Department of Health, including the following. So the clinical practice guidelines on communication are what we look for if it's only communication. For 18 months or older, this is pretty severe. No single words by 18 months. And this would mean word approximations. The child's looking at a ball and goes, bah, that's a word. So they have no single words by 18 months of age. A vocabulary of fewer than 30 words by 24 months of age, that's a little less severe in my opinion, right? But it's still fairly severe, but that's the standard. And no two-word combinations by 36 months of age. So that to me is an extremely severe delay. No two-word combinations by 36 months of age is a very severe delay. So what is significant enough? It's not enough to simply say child at 18 months has no words, or child that is 24 months with a 30-word vocabulary, or a child that's 36 months. Just repeating the regulatory language is not enough. Rather, we have to bring that child to life. If we find that this child truly should be eligible for services, because in our clinical opinion, we've got a very severe delay based on the standards in the 2010 regs, we've got to prove that. We've got to show that. If the child has 30 words, only 30 words, or less than 30 words, let's write the 20 words the child has. If the child has no two-word combinations at 36 months, let's give them a sense of how they're communicating. Do they have gestures? Do they have one word? Are they just totally frustrated? Bring that child to life. If the child has no words at 18 months, well, how are they communicating? Are they pointing? Is it a child like Maya that we saw earlier on that really has a lot going on but just can't use the words because of motor issues, because she has cerebral palsy, versus the fact that she has really a significant delay in language skills? How is she communicating? Certainly she'd qualify for speech and language services, right, in the communication domain. But what can we really tell about how she's communicating? That would be so much more informative and elucidating than simply saying, oh, she doesn't have any words, which is probably what happened when poor Maya was originally evaluated. So we've got to learn how to dig deeper than simply counting words. Or as I've heard so many people say in the last 2 weeks, we have to do a deep dive into what's truly going on with this child. So what about it? What is significant enough to be eligible for services for a child younger than 18 months? Well, this gets a little more specific. We have to show the child has none of the normal language developmental milestones expected for the child in the younger age range, right? So if it's an 18-month-old, they're going to have none of the normal developmental milestones expected for a child at 12 months. And none of the upper limit of the child's current chronological age, and the presence of a preponderance of established prognostic indicators of communication delay, which will not resolve itself without intervention. We're going to go into that in Module 3. You'll be able to see what are the prognostic indicators of a communication delay and how do we write that in an evaluation. So this concludes Module 1 of Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Evaluations, what every EI evaluator needs to know. We have lots of materials if you still want to research some more at leadersproject.org, which is a website I maintain as part of my work at Teachers College, Columbia University. There's some free CEUs there where you look at grammar fundamentals for a pluralistic society. We have developmental diagnosis and a preschool evaluation. This is fairly appropriate. We're going to look at some of this evaluation later on because he was a 2-year, 10-month-old when I evaluated him. Disorder, difference, or gap, a school age disability evaluation, which is of a 13-year-old. We do have model speech, language, and psychological evaluations so you can see how to make these happen. We have test reviews of most commonly used tests, so that all that material is available for free at that leadersproject.org. I look forward to seeing you in Module 2, where we're going to be talking about the problems with the current widely used EI evaluation tests.